The unbreakable vow. The grand hall of the Xyrelian palace was filled with shimmering lights from floating crystals. Thousands of Xyrelians stood in silence, their golden eyes focused on the raised platform where their princess stood. Princess Xyra, daughter of Emperor Zorith, stood tall, her violet skin glowing under the ceremonial lights. She raised her right hand, her sharp nails reflecting the golden glow. Her voice was strong, clear, and filled with pride. "I swear on the sacred stars, I will never marry a human." The crowd erupted in cheers. The sound echoed through the palace, shaking the walls. The Xyrelians were a proud race, strong and powerful. To them, humans were weak, fragile creatures who did not deserve respect. Xyra looked down at her father, the emperor. His expression was unreadable, but she knew he disapproved. He had been speaking of alliances, of peace with humans. But Xyra refused. She would never lower herself to such disgrace. Her cousin, Prince Kale, smirked from the side. He was the only one who truly understood her hatred for humans. He whispered, "Well said, princess. They are nothing but insects." Xyra nodded. She believed it too. But fate had other plans. The human intruder. Far from the palace, in the dark sky of Xyrelia, a ship was burning. It was small, sleek, and clearly human-made. Its engines sputtered as it fell, spiraling toward the surface. Inside, Captain James Carter gritted his teeth, struggling with the controls. "This is Captain Carter, requesting emergency assistance. Anyone receiving this?" No response. Only static. James's ship was going down, and there was nothing he could do. He braced for impact. The explosion was massive. The crash shook the forest outside the Xyrelian capital. The sky lit up with fire, and the sound of metal twisting and breaking filled the air. Xyrelian guards arrived within minutes. They surrounded the burning wreckage, weapons drawn. The metal hissed as it cooled, and then, a movement. A figure crawled out of the flames. A human. Captain James Carter coughed, his body aching. His uniform was torn, his hands were covered in dirt and blood, but he was alive. Before he could move, Xyrelian guards seized him. Cold metal cuffs locked around his wrists. A commander stepped forward. "Take him to the palace. Let the emperor decide his fate." James was dragged away, his mind racing. He was deep in enemy territory, completely alone. Face to face with the princess. The palace was even more magnificent up close. Towering spires touched the sky, and golden energy pulsed through the walls. James was pushed forward into the throne room. The emperor sat on a massive throne of black stone, his piercing golden eyes scanning the human before him. Beside him stood Princess Xyra. The moment she saw the prisoner, her eyes narrowed with disgust. "A human," she spat. "What is this filth doing here?" James lifted his chin. He had seen that look before. Arrogance. Disgust. He was used to it. The emperor studied James carefully. "You are a pilot." James nodded. "Yes. My ship was attacked. I didn't come here by choice." Prince Kale scoffed. "He is lying. Humans always lie." Xyra stepped forward. "Let me end this, father. One strike, and we'll be rid of him." James's hands clenched into fists, but he stayed silent. He wasn't foolish enough to start a fight in the middle of an alien throne room. But to his surprise, the emperor raised a hand. "No." Xyra frowned. "What?" The emperor's voice was firm. "This human saved himself from a crash. He survived enemy fire. He is not weak." James stared at the emperor. Was that respect in his tone? The emperor turned to Xyra. "You have sworn to never marry a human. But do you fear one?" Xyra's pride burned. "Of course not." The emperor smirked. "Then prove it. Let him be your personal guard. If humans are as weak as you say, he will die soon enough." The room fell silent. Xyra's heart pounded. Her personal guard. A human. This was an insult. She opened her mouth to argue, But the Emperor's gaze was final. She had no choice. Zyra turned to James, her expression filled with hatred. "You will regret ever stepping foot on my planet, human." James, still bruised and beaten, gave a small smirk. "I already do, Princess." The challenge. That night, the palace was filled with whispers. A human as the princess's personal guard. It was unthinkable. Zyra paced in her chambers, furious. This could not stand. She needed to humiliate him, prove to everyone that he was nothing but a weak creature. An idea formed in her mind. She sent a message to James, summoning him to the royal training arena. If she was forced to keep him as a guard, then she would make sure he never dared to challenge her again. The next morning, the training arena was packed with spectators. The sun cast long shadows across the sand. James stood in the center, rolling his shoulders. He had expected hostility, but this was something else. The entire crowd wanted to see him fail. Zyra entered, wearing royal battle armor. A blade rested in her hand, its tip gleaming. "This is not a fight to the death," she said coldly. "But you will bow before me, human." James sighed, shaking his head. Why did aliens always think humans were weak? He raised his fists. "We'll see about that, Princess." Zyra lunged. A human's bravery. Princess Zyra's ears were ringing. Smoke filled the air, and the sharp scent of burning metal stung her nose. She tried to move, but a heavy weight pressed down on her. Then she realized it was him. Captain James Carter lay across her, shielding her with his body. His uniform was torn, and a fresh burn marked his arm. He was injured, because of her. For the first time in her life, Zyra felt something she had never associated with a human before. Shock. Why did he save me? The arena in chaos. The crowd was in a panic. The explosion had come from the royal platform. Someone had tried to kill her. Guards rushed in, weapons drawn, searching for the attacker. James groaned and pushed himself up. His head was spinning, but his instincts told him one thing. The attack wasn't over. And he was right. A second blast tore through the stands, sending debris flying. From the smoke, figures in dark armor emerged, moving fast. Assassins. Their weapons hummed with deadly energy as they leaped onto the arena floor. The leader pointed directly at Zyra. "Kill the princess." Zyra tried to reach for her weapon, but her vision blurred from the blast. The assassins lunged. James didn't hesitate. He moved fast, grabbing a fallen staff from the sand and blocking the first attack. The assassin's energy blade slashed across his arm, burning his skin, but he didn't stop. He twisted the staff and slammed it into the attacker's face, knocking him back. Zyra stared in disbelief. The human was fighting for her. Battle in the dust. More assassins surrounded them. Zyra forced herself to stand, shaking off the pain. She wasn't weak. She wouldn't let a human outshine her. She snatched up her blade and joined the fight. James and Zyra fought side by side, their movements almost synchronized. He dodged and countered with raw speed, while she struck with precision and skill. James saw an assassin aiming at Zyra's back. "Behind you," he shouted, but she had already sensed it. She spun and struck, piercing the attacker's chest. For a moment, their eyes met. They understood each other in battle. But the fight wasn't over yet. The betrayal. The last assassin fell to the sand, lifeless. The dust began to settle. Guards arrived, surrounding them, weapons raised. James dropped the staff, breathing heavily. "You're welcome," he muttered. But Zyra's gaze had shifted. She was looking toward the royal platform. Her father, Emperor Zorith, was still seated, unharmed, but his face was dark with fury. Beside him, Prince Kael stepped forward, his voice filled with venom. "This was no random attack," Kael declared. "This was an attempt on the royal family. And there is only one outsider here." His golden eyes locked onto James. "The human is responsible." The accusation. James froze. The crowd murmured in agreement. Whispers of "it was the human" spread like wildfire. Zyra snapped back to reality. She turned to Kale, anger flashing in her eyes. "That's ridiculous. He saved my life." Kale smirked. "Or maybe he staged the attack to earn your trust." James clenched his fists. "Are you serious? I nearly got blown apart trying to protect your princess." Kale ignored him. He turned to the Emperor. "This is why humans cannot be trusted." The Emperor remained silent, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. "Take him." James barely had time to react before guards grabbed him. "What?" Zyra's voice rose. "Father, no. You saw what he did." "He." Her father's gaze stopped her mid-sentence. "We will investigate. If he is innocent, he will live." The unspoken words hung in the air. If he is guilty, he will die. James didn't resist. He stared at Zyra, frustration in his eyes. "I saved you," he said, "and this is what I get." Zyra opened her mouth, but she had no answer. As the guards dragged James away, she felt something she had never felt before. Doubt. For the first time, she wasn't sure if everything she had believed about humans was true. A forbidden mission. Princess Zyra stood frozen as Captain James Carter was dragged away by the palace guards. His blue eyes locked onto hers, filled with frustration, but not fear. "I saved you," he had said, "and this is what I get." His words echoed in her mind. The human had shielded her with his own body, had fought beside her, had blood for her, and now, her own people, her own cousin, Prince Kell, had turned against him, branding him a traitor. But why? Zyra clenched her fists. Something wasn't right. As the grand doors of the arena slammed shut behind James, her father's voice pulled her back to the present. "The matter is settled," Emperor Zoreth said, his tone final. "The human will remain in the dungeons until we learn the truth." Zyra's heart pounded. There is no truth to learn. He's innocent. But she said nothing. Because deep inside, she knew her father's decisions were law, and challenging him would mean risking everything. The dungeon and the deception. James sat on the cold stone floor, wrists bound in Zyrelian energy cuffs. The cell smelled of damp air and rust. He'd been in worse places before, but never for saving someone's life. He exhaled sharply. Figures. You save a princess, and they throw you in prison. Footsteps echoed down the dark corridor. The heavy iron door creaked open. Zyra stepped in, her royal robes brushing the dust. Her gaze was unreadable, but James could see something different in her eyes. She was thinking. Hard. James let out a humorless chuckle. "What's this? A royal visit? Should I bow or just sit here like a good prisoner?" Zyra crossed her arms. "Do you ever stop talking?" "Not when I've been wrongfully accused." She ignored the remark and stepped closer. "Tell me the truth. Why were you really on Zyrelia?" James tilted his head. "You still think I had something to do with that attack?" Zyra hesitated. He smirked. "That's cute. You think I could plan an assassination while crash landing on an alien planet?" "Yeah, real mastermind move." She hated that she almost smirked back, but she shoved the thought aside. "My father believes Kale," she said, lowering her voice. "But I don't trust him." James's eyes sharpened. "Why?" Zyra glanced toward the corridor before whispering. "Because someone warned me of an attack, before it even happened." James frowned. "Who?" She hesitated again, but then said, "I don't know." The message was anonymous. James leaned forward, interested now. "And you're just telling me this now?" "I didn't think it mattered," she admitted, "but now I do." James exhaled. "Great. So what now? You let me out of here. We go punch your cousin in the face and call it a day." Zyra gave him a look. "It's not that simple." James smirked. "It never is." The secret mission. That night, under the cover of darkness, Syra made her decision. She couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Something was wrong in the palace, and James was not the enemy. Slipping past the guards, she entered the dungeon again. This time, she carried something, a small device that deactivated the energy cuffs. She knelt and placed it against James's restraints. With a soft hum, the cuffs unlocked. James rubbed his wrists, blinking. "Huh, didn't think you had it in you, princess." She stood. "Don't make me regret this." James smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it." Zara took a deep breath. "We're going to the royal archives. If there's a conspiracy, we'll find proof there." James stretched his arms. So, breaking into a royal vault, stealing classified information, and exposing a plot against the throne. He grinned. "Sounds like fun." Zara rolled her eyes. "Just follow my lead." Infiltrating the archives. The royal archives were heavily guarded, but Sarah knew the secret tunnels built beneath the palace. She led James through the dark, twisting corridors, their footsteps silent on the stone floor. "Ever done anything like this before?" James whispered. Sarah's eyes flickered in the dim light. "I am the princess. No one expects me to sneak around." James chuckled. "Guess we're both breaking expectations tonight." They'd reached the archive doors. Sarah pressed her hand to a biometric scanner, and the heavy doors slid open. Inside, massive holographic scrolls floated in midair, glowing softly with ancient text. James whistled. "Fancy." Zira ignored him and moved swiftly to a central console. "The royal family keeps records of all political dealings here. If Kale is involved in something illegal, we'll find it." She pressed a series of commands, and data began streaming onto a floating screen. James leaned closer, reading. Then he froze. "Sarah, look at this." Her eyes widened. The document showed secret meetings between Kale and an unknown faction. Large sums of resources had been moved under Kale's command without the Emperor's approval. And then, at the bottom of the screen, one sentence sent a chill down her spine. Tarjiki, Princess XYR. Stay to use. Eliminate. Her breath caught. He really tried to kill me. James exhaled. Yeah. And he's not done yet. The discovery and the ambush. Before they could process the information, a loud alarm blared. Zyra's heart dropped. They had been discovered. Time to go. James grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the exit. But as they turned the corner, figures blocked their path. Prince Kale stood at the head of the guards, his golden eyes gleaming. Well, he said, "I was wondering how long it would take before you realized the truth, cousin." Zyra's pulse raced. "You betrayed us. You betrayed the Emperor." Kale chuckled. "Oh, Exira, the Empire needs new leadership, strong leadership. Our father is weak. And humans, they have no place in the future of Zerelia." James stepped forward. "You know, for a guy who just got caught red-handed, you sure talk a lot." Cal's smirk widened. "That's because you won't be leaving this place alive." He snapped his fingers. Guards closed in. Zyra and James had nowhere to run. Alone with the human. Smoke curled through the air as alarms blared across the palace. Zyra and James stood trapped in the royal archives, Cal's guards surrounding them. The glow of energy weapons bathed the ancient chamber in an eerie red light. James glanced at Zyra. "You got a plan, princess." Zyra's pulse pounded. She had expected Cal's corruption, but not so soon, not so directly. He was no longer hiding in the shadows. He was here to kill her. Cal smirked. "Surrender, cousin. You've spent your whole life following the rules. Be smart and do it one last time." James shifted his stance, eyes sharp. "Something tells me she's not in a surrendering mood." Cal's smirk faded. "Kill them." The guards raised their weapons. And Hera made her decision. She slammed her palm onto a control panel. The entire floor beneath them shifted. Suddenly, the ground vanished. The fall into darkness. James felt the rush of air as the floor beneath them collapsed. Zaira had triggered an emergency escape chute, one of many hidden pathways beneath the palace. They plummeted into darkness. James twisted midair, grabbing Zaira just before they hit the bottom. They landed hard on a metal platform, tumbling in a heap. For a moment, everything was silent. Then James groaned. "You okay, princess?" Zaira pushed herself up, rubbing her head. "I should be asking you that. You broke my fall." James smirked, sitting up. "Guess we're even now." She scowled, standing quickly. "We need to move. Kale won't stop hunting us." James stood, dusting himself off. "Right. So where exactly are we?" Zaira turned, her golden eyes scanning the ancient tunnels beneath the palace. An old escape route. The royal family built them centuries ago. James looked at the cracked walls and glowing glyphs along the corridors. "Charming. Got any weapons down here?" Zaira shook her head. "No, only a path to the outside." James sighed. "Well, that's something." Then, distant voices echoed down the tunnels. Zaira's eyes widened. "They're already looking for us." James grinned. "Then we'd better get moving. A dangerous escape." They ran through the tunnels, their footsteps echoing off the ancient stone walls. The passage was narrow, lit only by faintly glowing Zyrelian markings. James glanced at Zaira as they ran. "So your cousin just admitted he's a traitor and tried to kill you. That's got to sting." Zaira's jaw tightened. "He's always hated me, but I never thought he would actually betray the throne." James shrugged. "Power does that to people. He wants to rule, and you're in the way." Zaira didn't respond. She hated that he was right. After a few minutes, they reached a dead end. James stopped, breathing heavily. "Tell me this tunnel has an exit." Zaira walked forward, placing her palm on a section of the wall. "It does." The glyphs flickered, and the wall shifted open, revealing the hidden passage. They stepped through, only to find a massive underground cavern stretching before them. A deep ravine cut through the earth, filled with glowing blue water. On the other side, an ancient bridge hung by a thread. James groaned. "Of course. The one way out looks like it's been falling apart for 100 years." Zaira ignored him and stepped onto the bridge. The wood creaked dangerously. James hesitated. "You sure about this?" Zaira shot him a look. "Unless you want to go back and face Kel's men." James sighed. "Fine. But if I die, I'm haunting you." They moved carefully across the bridge, but halfway across, something snapped. The bridge lurched violently. James cursed. "This thing isn't going to hold." Zaira moved faster, but suddenly, the rope beneath her foot snapped. She slipped. James lunged, grabbing her wrist. Her heart pounded as she dangled over the abyss. Below, the glowing water churned like a storm. James gritted his teeth. "Hold on." Zaira's grip slipped. James pulled with all his strength, yanking her up. She tumbled onto the bridge beside him, breathless. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Zaira looked at him. "Why did you do that?" James blinked. What?" "You keep saving me," she said, her voice quieter. "Why?" James looked at her, then shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just an idiot." She studied him for a long moment before standing. "Let's go." They crossed the rest of the bridge in silence. A moment of truth. After another mile, they'd finally emerged from the tunnels. A cold wind rushed over them as they stepped onto a rocky cliffside, looking down at the vast alien landscape below. Zaira exhaled. "We made it." James smirked. "Barely." She turned toward him. "James." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you actually used my name. This must be serious." She ignored him. "I need to know something." James sighed. "Here we go." She stepped closer, searching his face. "What do humans really want?" James tilted his head. That's a big question, Princess. Answer it. He thought for a moment, then said, We want to survive. We want freedom. We want to protect the people we care about. She frowned. And war? James shrugged. Sometimes, yeah, but not always. Zyra hesitated. Then, softer, she asked, Do you hate us? James sighed. Look, your people treat humans like we're dirt, but that doesn't mean I hate you. She held his gaze. You don't trust me, though. James smirked. Trust takes time, Princess. For the first time, she almost smiled. That I can agree with. A distant sound made them both turn. Far in the distance, Zyrelian warships were moving. James exhaled. Looks like Kale isn't wasting time. Zyra nodded. We need to stop him. James smirked. You got a plan. She smirked back. Follow my lead. James chuckled. Now that's terrifying. The betrayal. The Zyrelian moons hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow over the jagged mountains. Zyra and James stood on a rocky cliff, watching in silence as Cal's warships moved across the valley below. James folded his arms. Well, Princess, I hate to break it to you, but your cousin is about to go full villain. Zyra's golden eyes narrowed. He's not just taking the throne. He's preparing for war. James glanced at her. Against who? Zyra clenched her fists. Everyone. James let out a slow breath. Great. So what's the plan? Please tell me it involves more than just running straight into his army. She smirked. We don't run. We infiltrate. James sighed. Of course we do. A risky return. Getting back into the palace wasn't easy. Kale had locked it down, doubling the guards. Every entrance was fortified, every corridor filled with soldiers. But Zyra knew the palace better than anyone. We go through the old servant tunnels, she whispered, leading James along a hidden path behind the cliffs. It's risky, but it's the only way inside. James smirked. Risky? I thought you Zyrelians didn't take risks. She rolled her eyes. Stay close, human. They slipped through a hidden passage, moving like shadows through the ancient corridors. As they neared the throne room, James whispered, All right, what exactly are we looking for? Zyra's expression darkened. Proof. Kel's alliance with the traitors. If we show my father, we can stop this. James raised an eyebrow. You still think your father is in control? She hesitated. He has to be. But deep down, doubt gnawed at her. The throne room deception. When they reached the throne room, they stopped cold. The grand doors were open. Inside, Emperor Zoreth sat on his throne. But something was wrong. Kale stood before him, speaking in a low, controlled voice. The Emperor's face was pale, his posture too stiff. James frowned. What's going on? Zyra's stomach twisted. Her father wasn't just sitting there. He was restrained. Kale turned, his sharp golden eyes locking onto them. His lips curled into a slow smirk. Well, he said, I was wondering when you'd return, dear cousin. Zyra's breath caught. They had walked straight into a trap, the ultimate betrayal. Guards stepped out of the shadows, weapons aimed. Zyra's pulse pounded. What have you done? Kale tilted his head. Isn't it obvious? The Emperor is no longer fit to rule. And you were always too soft. James exhaled. Wow, you really rehearsed this speech, didn't you? Cal's smirk faded. Silence, human. Zyra stepped forward. Kale, listen to me. War isn't the answer. Cal's expression darkened. You sound like my father. He turned toward the Emperor and sighed. He thought we could trust humans, thought we could share power. His gaze sharpened. But power isn't shared, it's taken. Zyra clenched her fists. You're insane. Kale ignored her, stepping closer to James. And you? He sneered. The only reason you're still alive is because I wanted you to see this moment. James raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. You're gonna have me executed in some dramatic fashion. Cale smirked. Not just you. He snapped his fingers. 2 guards appeared, dragging a battered Zyrelian general between them. Zyra staggered back in horror. Commander Vorik. The general had fought beside her father for years. He was one of their most loyal warriors. Now his face was bruised, his robes torn. Cale smiled coldly. He was a fool, just like the Emperor. He refused to swear loyalty to me. Zyra's throat tightened. You would betray your own blood. Cale sighed. You still don't understand, do you? He turned to the guards. Kill them all. A desperate fight. Everything happened at once. James lunged forward, grabbing a fallen guard's weapon. He spun, firing a blast toward Cale, but Cale dodged with inhuman speed. Zyra unsheathed her blade, clashing against the guards. Her heart raced. This wasn't a battle. This was survival. James dropped one guard with a sharp kick, then turned to Zyra. We need to get your father out of here. She nodded. Cover me. James blasted another guard as Zyra leaped toward the throne. She reached her father, pulling at the restraints. Father, can you stand? The Emperor's gaze was weak, but his voice was steady. You must stop Cale. Zyra gritted her teeth. Not without you. Suddenly, Cale appeared behind her. Foolish to the end, he whispered. Zyra spun just in time to block his strike. Their blades clashed, sparks flying. Cale was strong, stronger than before. Zyra's breath hitched. He's enhanced himself. Cale smirked, surprised. You should be. I am the future of Zyrelia. James fired at him, but Cale dodged effortlessly. He turned on James with a sneer. You don't belong here, human. James rolled his shoulders. You keep saying that, but I'm still here, aren't I? Cale's smirk faded. For the first time, James saw something in his eyes. Doubt. The narrow escape. Zyra didn't hesitate. She struck fast. Cale barely had time to react as her blade sliced across his shoulder. He stumbled back, hissing in pain. James smirked. Guess humans aren't as weak as you thought. Cale's golden eyes burned with rage. This isn't over. He reached for a small device on his wrist. Zyra's eyes widened. James. A shockwave exploded from Cale's device, knocking them backward. The world blurred. When Zyra opened her eyes, Cale was gone. James groaned. He ran, didn't he? Zyra clenched her fists. Yes. The Emperor coughed weakly. Zyra turned to him, gently lifting him up. Father, stay with me. His golden eyes softened. You were always stronger than I believed. James sighed. We need to move. If Cale's retreating, it's because he has something worse planned. Zyra nodded. We stop him. James smirked. Now that's a plan I can get behind. As the first light of dawn touched the palace, Zyra knew one thing for certain. This war was just beginning. The last stand. The palace walls trembled under the force of distant explosions. Cale had fled, but he was not defeated. His warships now loomed over the capital, their weapons primed, ready to burn Zyrelia to the ground. Zyra tightened her grip on her sword, standing at the edge of the throne room. This was war now. James checked the stolen weapon he had grabbed from a fallen guard. I'm guessing your cousin isn't coming back to talk things out. Zyra's golden eyes burned with determination. Cale doesn't talk. He conquers. James sighed. Yeah, I figured. So what's the plan? Because right now we're standing in the middle of his target. The Emperor, still weak but conscious, rose from his throne. His voice was softer than before, but firm. The palace is lost. We must fall back and regroup. Zyra's heart clenched. Her home, the heart of her people, abandoned. But her father was right. If they stayed, they would all die. She turned to James. You asked me once what humans wanted. Now I ask you, when your home is burning, What do you do? James met her gaze. You fight for it. Zyra nodded. Then let's fight. Escape through fire. The sky burned red as warships descended. Zyrelian soldiers clashed with Kel's loyalists in the streets. The once glorious city was falling apart. Zyra led the way through the palace corridors, James at her side, the Emperor supported by 2 of his remaining royal guards. They moved fast, but Kel's forces were already inside. From the upper balconies, a group of Kel's elite warriors spotted them. There, kill the Emperor. Blaster fire rained down. James tackled Zyra out of the way as a beam obliterated a marble column behind her. Why is it always me saving you? James muttered as he helped her up. Zyra glared. You think I need saving? James smirked. You're welcome, by the way. She didn't get to reply. More guards rushed down the stairwells, blades drawn. Zyra swung her sword, meeting the first attacker head-on. Sparks flew as their blades clashed. She twisted, dodged, and landed a swift strike to the enemy's shoulder, sending him collapsing to the ground. James, now armed with 2 stolen weapons, fought back with pure human adaptability. He fired twice, then spun around to disarm an enemy with a swift kick. He wasn't trained like a Zyrelian warrior, but he was unpredictable. And unpredictable was exactly what they needed. They fought their way through the palace halls, bodies dropping around them. Zyra caught a glimpse of her father ahead, his guards struggling to keep up. He was weaker than he let on. They didn't have much time. We need to get to the hangar, she shouted. James fired at an enemy above them. Lead the way, princess. The betrayer's final move. They reached the royal hangar, a massive chamber carved into the mountain below the palace, where starships gleamed under emergency lights. Zyra turned to her father. We get you out of here first. The Emperor nodded, but his gaze was distant. He knew his kingdom was crumbling around him. Then the entire chamber shook. A warship hovered outside the hangar doors. Its energy cannons charged, glowing bright with destructive power, and standing at the open ramp of the warship was Kale. Zyra's breath caught. You coward. Kale smirked. You should be thanking me, cousin. I'm giving you a choice. Swear loyalty to me or die here. Zyra lifted her blade. You already know my answer. Kale sighed. I hoped you'd say that. Then, the warship's cannons fired. The hangars fall. The explosion ripped through the hangar. The blast sent James and Zyra tumbling backward. The shockwave knocked over ships, sending them crashing into each other like dominoes. Through the fire and smoke, Kale descended from the warship, blade in hand. His personal guard followed behind, weapons gleaming. James groaned, pushing himself up. I think I just lost hearing in my left ear. Zyra ignored him, eyes locked on Kale. This ends here. Kale grinned. Yes, it does. And then he charged. Zyra barely blocked his strike in time. Their blades clashed, sparks flying. Kale was stronger now, faster, more ruthless. He had enhanced himself with forbidden technology, and it showed. Every attack he threw was like a storm, powerful, unrelenting. The Hiller struggled to keep up. James, still recovering, saw Kel's guards moving toward the Emperor. His eyes hardened. Oh no, you don't. He threw himself into the fight. He fired twice, dropping one guard, then ducked under a swing from another, flipping the enemy over his shoulder. Zyra and Kel's battle raged across the hangar, the floor cracking beneath their strikes. Zyra's breath was ragged. She couldn't hold out much longer. Kel's smirk widened. You can't win, cousin. Then he struck, a brutal slice across her side. Zyra gasped, stumbling. Blood dripped onto the ground. Kale raised his blade for the final strike. And then, a gunshot rang out. Kale froze. A single burning hole glowed in his shoulder. James had shot him. The smirk vanished from Cal's face. James lowered the weapon. Sorry, I know you Zarelians like your dramatic sword fights, but I don't fight fair. Kale staggered back. His golden eyes flickered in disbelief. He looked at Syra, then at James, and he snarled, "This isn't over." With the last of his strength, he activated a transport beacon. His body shimmered, vanishing into thin air. Syra collapsed onto one knee, gripping her wound. James rushed to her side. "You good?" he asked. She smirked weakly. "I'll live." The Emperor, now standing, spoke. "Kale is gone. For now. But he will return." James exhaled. "And I'm guessing he's gonna be pissed." Zyra's gaze hardened. "Then we'll be ready." The war wasn't over, but they had won this battle. And for the first time, Syra knew she didn't have to face it alone. Love and war. The Zyrelian night was heavy with the scent of smoke and burning metal. Fires still smoldered across the city, and the once great capital now lay in ruins, its streets scared from Cal's brutal attack. But despite the destruction, the people had not fallen. Zyra stood on the highest balcony of the Emperor's temporary stronghold, overlooking the battered city below. She had won the battle, but the war was far from over. James stepped beside her, arms crossed. He had cleaned up after the fight, but bruises still marked his face, and his movements were stiff with pain. "Hell of a view," he muttered. Zyra didn't answer. Her eyes remained locked on the distant horizon, where Cal's warships had disappeared into the black void of space. James studied her. "You're thinking about him." She exhaled. "I should have killed him." James shrugged. "Would have saved us some trouble." She finally turned to look at him. "You don't approve." James gave her a small smirk. "Oh no, Princess. I'm all for stabbing your evil cousin. I just don't think it's that simple." Zyra frowned. "It should be. He's a traitor." James sighed. "Yeah, but he's also family. And killing family. That never ends clean." Zyra didn't respond. She had spent her whole life believing in strength, in honor. But now, she wasn't sure what she believed anymore. James nudged her lightly. "Hey, you're not alone in this." For the first time in a long time, Syra let herself believe that. But there was no time for doubt. Because Cal was still out there. And he was coming back. Cal's return. The next morning, a scout ship returned from deep space. The pilot stumbled out, bloodied, and barely conscious. Zyra and James met him in the war room, where the Emperor's generals were gathered. The pilot collapsed to his knees, gasping. James helped him up. "What happened?" The pilot's voice was hoarse. "Kale has raised an army." Syra stiffened. "Where?" The pilot's hands trembled as he activated a holographic display. A massive fleet of warships appeared in the air above the table, far larger than the forces Cal had commanded before. "He's allied with the Vorthak," the pilot continued. "A race of mercenaries. They're ruthless. They don't take prisoners." The room fell into silence. James whistled. "Well, that's bad." Syra's father, the Emperor, finally spoke. "He means to destroy us." A heavy weight settled over the room. Cal had lost the battle, but he hadn't retreated. He had gone to prepare for the final war. And now he was ready. Zyra took a deep breath. "Then we make our stand." The Battle of Zarelia. The Zyrelian capital had been abandoned. The people were evacuated to underground strongholds, while Syra's forces prepared for the final battle. James stood at the edge of the war room, watching as alien warriors, rebel soldiers, and former palace guards all gathered under Ktara's command. It was an army born from desperation, but sometimes that was the most dangerous kind. James walked over to Syra, who was strapping on her royal battle armor. "You ready for this?" She met his gaze. "Are you?" He smirked. "Not even a little." She almost smiled. Then the alarm sounded. Cal had arrived. The final duel. The sky was filled with warships. Energy blasts rained down like meteors, shaking the mountains as Cyrus' forces rushed to meet the enemy. James fought on the front lines, blasting through enemy ranks. His human instincts, ***, quick reflexes, unpredictable moves, ***, gave him an edge. But Sarah had only one target, Kale. She spotted him in the chaos, leading the enemy charge like a war god. His armor gleamed, his enhanced body moving like a phantom through the battlefield. Their eyes met, and they both knew this was the end. Sarah pushed forward, cutting through enemy soldiers until she reached him. Kale smiled. Finally. Then they clashed. Brother against sister. Their blades struck like lightning. Kale was faster than before, stronger. Every move he made was enhanced, calculated. But Sarah had something he didn't. She had something to fight for. With every block, every counter, she thought of the people who depended on her, the warriors who fought beside her. And James. Kale sneered. You think you can beat me? Sarah exhaled. I already have. Then, with one swift, perfect strike, she severed Kale's weapon hand. He stumbled back, eyes wide in shock. Blood dripped from the wound. Sarah pointed her blade at his throat. It's over. But Kale only laughed. You don't have the nerve to kill me. Sarah's grip tightened. Then she made her decision. She turned her blade and struck the ground instead. Kale frowned. What are you doing? Sarah straightened. You wanted to rule. You wanted power. Fine. She stepped closer. But you will never be emperor, because an emperor rules with more than just a blade. Kale's eyes darkened. Then, before he could react, James fired a stun blast. Kale collapsed. James exhaled. Honestly, that was way too dramatic. Sarah sheathed her sword. It had to be. James raised an eyebrow. So, what now? She looked out at the battlefield. Kale's forces had lost their leader. Without him, the enemy army fell apart. The war was over. Sarah looked down at Kale's unconscious body. Now, we'd rebuild. After the war, days passed. The people returned to the city. Rebuilding began. Kale was taken into custody, not executed. Sarah made sure of that. The war had cost them much, but Zarellia still stood, and Sarah was stronger than ever. One evening, she stood on the palace balcony, watching the sunset. James walked up beside her. You did it. She glanced at him. We did it. James smirked. So, I have to ask. You once swore you'd never marry a human. Still feel that way? Sarah hesitated. Then, she did something unexpected. She smiled. I don't know, she said. Maybe humans aren't so bad. James laughed. That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. She rolled her eyes. Enjoy it while it lasts, human. He smirked. Oh, I will. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the war was over. And for the first time, Sarah wasn't just fighting for her people. She was fighting for something more. The future.